More than 10,000 Canadians have now died from COVID-19. 10,000. We passed that tragic milestone just this past week, and it comes with growing concerns about the growing number of coronavirus cases in our country. Several provinces, from BC to Quebec, have recently broken daily case records set back in the spring, and the situation in Manitoba has worsened to the point that strict new shutdowns will be imposed in Winnipeg starting tomorrow. But in many places, people who work in intensive care units worry about not having enough capacity, especially when it comes to balancing the coronavirus with flu season. Those who own small businesses worry if they'll be able to weather the storm. And there's concern about whether we'll be able to gather with loved ones this Christmas. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau put it at a briefing this past Tuesday, this sucks. And indeed, this can all feel like too much sometimes. In fact, a lot of the time. This pandemic is exhausting. It is constantly challenging our resilience, both individually and collectively. Michael Ungar has spent more than 2 decades studying how people deal in the face of adversity. He's the director of the Resilience Research Centre at Dalhousie University in Halifax. And recently, he has been researching how resilience is playing out during the pandemic. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Pia.
This word, this concept, we hear it being tossed around, used a lot these days. How would you describe resiliency?
Well, I describe it as both our inner capacities to overcome adversity, but also whether or not we have the resources around us to be our best and our boldest selves. And, it's funny, there's so much misunderstanding about resilience. You see the word so often used to describe that, that individual capacity to overcome, the personal grit and these kinds of things. And where the science is actually going now is in a completely different direction. It's shown very clearly that, we succeed when the world around us provides us with the resources we need to actually do well. We need close work colleagues to connect to in the workplace. I need a loving parent, or at least somebody to whom I really matter. And we switch that from a parent, of course, to our spouses or partners later in life. I always like to think of it, kind of those layers of the onion, that as you get further and further out, and there's been a lot of research that says, that you want to be able to strengthen each of these particular layers. And now what's really interesting, of course, is we're getting to the point where we're understanding that the resilience of our climate or our ecosystem is also going to have a direct impact on our own individual well-being. So we're kind of getting to the point now where we understand that, my healthy ability to cope under huge amounts of stress is in direct relationship to the health and the sustainability of these other, systems, because, of course, each of those aspects of our lives either add stress and supports or take away stress and supports.
I want to talk about our children, because during this pandemic, you see parents posting that, perhaps this pandemic, and perhaps paradoxically, will make their kids stronger in the long run because they will have learned to cope with hard things. How much does adversity cultivate rather than challenge resilience?
There's a very, strong evidence that we need stress. But the trick is to create manageable amounts of stress for our children. The ideal formula is that you push them just to what's referred to as the zone of proximal development. In other words, you push them off their game, but you make sure that they have the resources to fix the situations that they tumble themselves into. In other words, you broke it, you fix it, right? You want kids to constantly be sort of pushed a little bit to do those types of things. So during this pandemic, in some ways it is an opportunity to develop strengths, to have them step up. If you're a parent and you're on the phone all day long on Zoom calls and, you're working from home, there's absolutely nothing wrong with parentifying your child a little bit and saying, you're going to be, obviously you're more like a 12-year-old than a 6-year-old. You're going to help cook dinner tonight, or you're going to look after a younger sibling, or, you're going to pick up some of the slack here so that mom or dad can actually maintain the family's income. Currently, when I do research all around the world with resilient kids, we see this pattern of parentification and genuine contribution to the family. These kids will say that, this is a positive experience in some regards because it gives me an adult status. I like to feel older. I like the sense of meaning it brings into my life.
Michael, I wish you could see me, because you would see actually this physical release of my body when you say parentifying your children is a good thing, because so many of us have been doing that. So thank you for making me feel good about that instead of guilty, which is another thing that many of us are feeling these days. You talk about exposing children and the importance of exposing them to the harsher realities of life. What do you mean by that? And why is that important? Because arguably, I mean, living through a pandemic is one of the harsher realities of life. Not that any one of us chose to expose our children or ourselves to this.
So I take my cue from, Grimm's Brothers fairy tales here on this one. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of, supporting evidence of this. Already in children's minds, they're afraid, right? They think the worst. The world is a scary place. And by us avoiding it and sort of, in a Disney kind of way, sugarcoating it, it's not actually that helpful. It doesn't leave children feeling strong. It actually makes them feel more anxious and worried. And that's why the old fairy tales were full of blood and gore. And, when Little Red Riding Hood walks into the cottage and sees the wolf in her grandma's clothing or whatever, she's eaten. End of story. And in some ways, if you look around, even around the world where people have myths about, why do you not have children going out on the ice in northern climates and this type of thing, there was always sort of evil spirits and evil things that would capture the child. There was danger out there in the world. And by doing that, you're raising a more, in a sense, healthier, robust child who understands that that they can get hurt, but then their solution to getting hurt is also under their control. Don't go on the ice. Don't go into the forest alone, right? So I'm always very, very worried when I hear parents kind of sugarcoating all this for kids and taking away the child's opportunities for the resilience that they need.
Yeah.
Partly because we know kids already want the danger. They want to know that the danger is there, that someone is going to actually protect them from it in real ways, not imagined.
And you say during this pandemic that we should explain to kids, look, people are dying from COVID-19, because you argue that this helps them understand why they have to stay home or why they have to wear a mask. In other words, why they have to make sacrifices.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting one. I'm sure you're doing this with your kids as I'm doing this with mine. Children do better when they have an opportunity for meaning in their life. We all do that. We all need meaning in our life. And there is a wonderful opportunity here. I'm not trying to make light of the fact that many people have died, but there is an opportunity here for our kids to feel that their sacrifices are meaningful. And and that means that we have to name it, that you're not necessarily, I mean, not too many children will die of this disease, but their grandparents will. Mm-hmm. And so if we give children that sense that, you're doing something benevolent for others in your community, that gives them a sense of power. I think it makes them more resilient. And we know that from any time that a child can make a contribution, that they really feel like they're helping. And I've even blogged about, children should have chores during this period of time and that type of thing. That kind of feeling of contribution and meaning is a core part of individual resilience, that psychological space we need to get through a crisis. A child just doesn't develop that sitting in the corner looking in the mirror. They develop that through caring adults who provide the right opportunity for that kind of thing to occur.
You're currently doing some research on resilience in the United States during the pandemic. Of course, the United States has been hit much harder than we have here in Canada by COVID. What are you looking at there, and what are you learning?
Well, what we've been doing is actually looking at a matched sample of 5,000 parents and their children, and also young adults, and another sample of people who are employed or in some sort of employment situation. And I mean, the trends are kind of not that hopeful. Things have slid, and this is not just this study that we're doing, but there's lots of data that shows that if you go back a year or two, it's quite remarkable how much things have declined for people. They're 2, 3, 4 times more people are reporting anxiety and mental health problems. What is also interesting is that it changes by age. So when we weren't just looking at the problems, we were also looking at resilience. And we found that, younger children who are, if you think about it, more sheltered by their families, more stable, they were showing, about 45% of kids were sort of saying, we're really quite high on the resilience scores. And parents themselves, partly because they have a mission, they have something that they can do. I think they feel activated that they're actually trying to keep their kids safe and that type of thing. About 42% of them showed high resilience as well. It was the adolescents, the younger adults who showed the worst mental health, if you will. They were the ones who were most concerned about Black Lives Matter, most concerned about Me Too, most put off of their routines by social distancing, the least likely, of course, to have those activities outside the home, and access to their peer groups, more likely to be spending endless amounts of time in passively online or engaged in social comparisons on social media. All these really bad things that we know sort of tear away at resilience and increase our propensity for mental health problems. And on the worker side, what we were finding is that, if you're full-time employed, about 37% of people showed really high resilience because even during this period. But that went down to half that amount if people had been laid off. So over and over again, the message is quite clear that our resilience is both a combination of those individual qualities. But when we encounter being, laid off from work or simply all our activities and contact to our peer networks, shattered, that resilience, that individual resilience is tested and very much begins to evaporate.
As I understand it, you talk about in families where there's more diversity, there is more resiliency. So when you use the word diversity, what do you mean by that?
By diversity, we're actually seeing, that was a bit of a surprise, that people in communities where there was more people of different racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, in the same communities, people who had come out of, just were different than you. That kind of diversity, both, by the way, in the workplace and in the community, seemed to be a factor that was associated with people having a significant increase in their resilience. It was as if somehow the diversity was increasing their ability to cope under stress. Now, this is, data that needs a bit more explanation. But at a time when we're becoming sort of, certainly in the U.S., there's that movement against immigration and refugees. There's a sort of isolationism taking hold, and they're having an election that's going to largely determine that path forward. It was interesting that the people who showed the most resilience were also those with the most diverse networks in the workplace and in their communities.
And so you use diversity in the very broad sense of the word. We're not just talking about, ethnic diversity or racial diversity, but I want to bring that up because we know, I don't need to tell you, that racialized people have been confronting systemic barriers in many ways for far too long, for many, many years. So what does that mean for resilience for people of color in this time, especially when COVID is hitting our communities disproportionately and disproportionately harder?
It's a very confusing situation because those communities, what we've seen is, of course, that the resilience of those communities, their ability to cope with the pandemic, is that much less, not because they themselves as individuals are somehow weaker, but because the conditions in which people were living, housing, jobs, the precariousness of the kinds of work that people were doing, that all put them at increased risk when something like a public health crisis comes along. The message here, on the one hand, is extremely sad, but on the other hand, it does finally acknowledge. I mean, people can sort of fluff off the idea of inequality. Oh, well, everyone in Canada has equal opportunity and stuff like that. I think what this is stripping and laying bare very clearly is that kind of, Pollyannish attitudes are not enough. That if we're going to really help communities experience resilience, then we're going to have to put in place the structures and the support so that people can realize their ability to do really well. And I want to emphasize that again. There is nothing genetically or, latently inside people who have most suffered under this pandemic. There is nothing latently inside of them that made them more vulnerable. It was really, in almost all cases, attributable to the quality of the housing, quality of job opportunities, their economic status, these kinds of factors. And those can be changed by good government policies, which one does have to hope that maybe some of the changes that we've put in place, almost like a guaranteed income supplement that's kind of initiated in Canada, some of these things will linger to make populations as resilient as possible before the next big crisis.
And listening to you, Michael Ungar, I think, maybe we shouldn't put so much stock in this. Because when we think of resilience on an individual level and how we kind of use it, it's like maybe we shouldn't be expected to just bounce back from bad things. And the attempt to cultivate this bounce back may be misguided or leaves many people feeling shameful when they can't do it, shamed.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly what that whole pushback against sometimes resilience is that it's been adopted by people with an agenda to blame people who don't succeed. I would rather keep the word, because I do think it's a phenomenon that shifts our focus from people just developing disorders. But we're going to have to reclaim the definition. We're going to have to tidy it up and stop letting people misuse the word to basically blame victims of conditions external to themselves for not changing.
Just before I let you go, I know full well, and most of us do, that this pandemic has been anything but equitable. That said, it has been hard on every single human in different ways, but hard nonetheless. And I don't mean to ask you to put a gloss on this, but do you see something positive come out of our hardship during this shared experience, this pandemic, in terms of resiliency?
I do, actually. And if we cannot sort of forget the people who have died and, how difficult this has been for so many families displaced and economically and socially. If I'm hopeful, it's because we've seen in other studies of forest fires and these kinds of things that sometimes people revisit their values and come back stronger. I've seen families pull board games out of closets that were, I've seen people put away their cell phones. I've seen communities helping each other a little bit more. I've seen more people walking, exercising, changing those kinds of habits as well. Maybe we've been reminded that we all don't need to jump in our cars every morning and commute long distances, that there are other ways to work. And maybe the lingering effect of this is that we're all going to be a little bit more resilient and a little bit more able to take some of those risks and make changes in ways that actually will confront this kind of modern technological society that for most of us was putting our health at tremendous, tremendous risk.
Michael Ungar, always good to talk to you and get your perspective and expertise. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All the best, Pia.
Michael Ungar is the director of the Resilience Research Center at Dalhousie University in Halifax. Since I spoke with him, the research Michael mentioned he was doing about resilience in the United States during the pandemic has been published. You can find a link to it by going to our website, cbc.ca/Sunday.